this case study, which is my business that I've been growing for just a couple of years now, is building a regenerative economies at the local community. So I'm going to review quickly, try to get through this as quick as possible, but there's without going too deep. But my orientation to integral leadership in action comes from, about 20 years ago when we took a workshop in near Boulder with Ken Wilber, and plus I've read a lot of his works, but I was always wanting to apply integral to leading organizations, and particularly in the transformation that we're currently in. And that transformation is toward, at least the work that I'm doing is toward a circular economy to avoid catastrophic cultural collapse, basically, that could happen, but there's a lot of other factors. This is just one piece of it. So I'll go through that quickly and then get your input on leadership, ways to lead this. And I'll tell you a little bit here how I'm working to do it. So my orientation to leadership, to ILiA was, obviously starting with AQUIL and all of the evolving, which most of you are all up to speed on that, so we don't have to go there. My orientation towards leadership is one of collaboration. So collaborating across cognitive, emotional, and personal growth boundaries is a key feature that I'm trying to apply here. Action is that we're all in motion, we're all growing, we're developing, and now I think we're evolving toward a more, in our words that we often use, is a regenerative economy. My business is one of consulting. It's also it's data based, but it involves direct solutions. And those solutions involve the integration of basically bioresources, which are primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary is all of the ag industry. The secondary, which is my focus, is in the circular economy. I also run a state association of compost producers, so my focus is on recycling organics and composting. I won't go into the details of the association, but I've been doing this as long as I've been doing integral practice. So first of all, what are bioresources? Like I was saying, primary is food, fiber, feed, fuel, flowers, fertilizer, all of the biological resources that we engage with and interact with. And they're very intimate for us because it's about the living world, and then along with the non-living world, or the inorganic. The living world includes all of the organic and the plants and living. The secondary bioresources are known in California statute, at least, and pretty much throughout the United States and globally, as organic waste, which is landscape clippings, food scraps, manure, biosolids, which is sewage sludge, human manure. And then our goal is to turn all of those resources into what we refer to collectively as bioproducts. Like I said, I'm pretty much focused on the soil aspects, but other ones in our industry and colleagues, and I'm developing biofertilizers out of these feedstocks. Others are, producing electricity, chemicals, and other product materials. So again, this is just a graphic picture of what I just showed there. Products look a lot alike, as you well know, because they're soil products, and even the animal feed are dried and put in pellets and that sort of thing. So we're about closing the loop in the circular economy. Bioprocessing focuses on all the technologies that allow this to happen. But because the sources of the materials are local, we're about building distributed recycling technologies. And the macro economic view is that we're transitioning from a take, make, waste, pollute economic system to one that is fully recycling, make, use, reuse, remake, reuse, so that the materials themselves are consciously reused in the environment. A bigger macroeconomic picture divides the economy into basically plants and living things versus technical nutrients. So that's kind of the conceptual framework of what we're doing. But on a more local level, this is the model that we're basing our business development and the micro, I guess you could call it the micro to meso circular economy, which is every community has this because every community has food and water and transacts biological resources. So the top part is what we call the secondary, and that's the organic feedstocks going into manufacturing, all kinds of technologies there, and then that portfolio of products, which is, those are just broad categories like, mulch or compost or energy and so forth. But then they're used by, especially the soil ones, are used by the primary bioeconomy, which is mainly landscapes, agriculture, and natural and working lands. So we're transitioning away from a chemical economy to the bioresource economy. That was the secondary that I had put there, and the primary down at the bottom, just the way we've oriented this picture. There's also, and this is the part that I find the most challenging to lead or attempt to lead through collaboration, is what we have lacked for a better term, and just building on primary and secondary, are the tertiary bioresources, which of course water is the main one because there is no biology without water. And in fact, in California, as our prime example, because that's mainly where I work, 90% of the water that we use in California is used to grow things, 80% for ag and 10% for landscapes. All the remaining 10% is all the water we use in cooking and cleaning and washing and industry. So, but that's just one. Energy is a big part of it. Also, now we're measuring carbon technology. Capital is key because we got to invest in this and invest in the transformation. So all of this has to make sense from a capital perspective. EJ is environmental justice. So disadvantaged communities are highlighted and preferential for the government investment, and the private investment also has to take all of that into account. So you can see the complexity here. I'm kind of fond of looking at the number of dyads or relationships, which are bilateral into multilateral relationships in our industry. And I've been hosting for the last year a Healthy Soil Roundtable that includes a lot of the other stakeholders in this. And this is kind of what the dyads look like. So it's obviously very complex. And these are some of the organizations. I'm hosting it through the Association of Compost Producers, which is the one that I'm executive director of. And just with these number of dyads here, number of different relationships, one-to-one relationships, the complexity is mind-boggling, but at the same time, it's finite. It's a finite number of relationships. And if we're going to work together to promote that economy, the economy that I just breezed through, I'm working with, the federal government, with farmers, with the government, the state government, especially California Department of Food and Ag, Cal Recycle, universities. LA Sanitation has their own healthy soil strategy, and I'm working with them to develop programs in their city and so forth. And then there's other NGOs like Zero Foodprint and Rescape, which are all part of the mix here. So I just wanted to share what I think has worked and what hasn't worked. And this is where I would like some to be coached by you all to give me suggestions of what's worked for you and how I could apply, uh, these leadership concepts, which we haven't actually spelled out. I was realizing that before this presentation, and I was thinking about it pretty much off and on all day, is that I don't know if anybody has really published or put together a worksheet or a paper on what is integral leadership in action. This is kind of what's worked is for me is, first of all, thinking holistically, big picture, trying to comprehend everything. Also to simplify the pictures, the pictures that I just showed you help to simplify what we're trying to do. I've read recently a book with this title, Team of Teams by Stanley McChrystal, and I think the Team of Teams approach has merit. Also, distinguish the different vertical levels, which most people are pretty used to now. The levels of complexity, from an individual to a home to a business to a local government and so forth. And you can do the same economically from microeconomics to meso and macro. I think part of it is the individual horizontal diversity expressed in the diagram that I presented. And I'm finding that people kind of get it, but most people feel like they're in their own silos. So setting up collaboration between the silos is something that I'm continuously working on. Also, the personal process, which I'm not doing now because I'm doing all the talking, is listening from a perspective of presence and then inviting co-creative problem solving, which is part of the purpose of this. What's been challenging is communicating this complexity in a quick way. Obviously, everybody has their own depth of complexity in whatever they're doing, whether they're farmers or city government and so forth. Also communicating to multiple levels of cognitive and moral development all at once. That to me is the hugest challenge of integral leadership that I feel and experience. Also, my problem is that I can be overly abstract and conceptual. Although I've taught biology and chemistry at the high school level, I tend to try and think of these problems more at a graduate level. So I think that's an issue for me big time. Also needing or trying to be right. What I'm finding is that there is no right way, there's only workable ways. And I've got to always get off of that one. And then at this stage, not getting paid to collaborate. Most people, it's not part of their job description to collaborate across disciplines horizontally or vertically. But I think, to me, that's what has been my challenges. So this is coming to the clinic part. How do you all feel or intuit that an ILiA approach can support the facilitating or help catalyze this transition, help those of us who are in this portion of the industry to catalyze the transition from a linear to a circular regenerative economy? My view is that the ultimate objective is to help build resilient, sustainable, equitable, growing, evolving, carbon drawdown, integrally informed, basically, economies. And this, in my world, this is happening one community at a time. So I work with each individual jurisdiction, within the framework of my company, and there's others who are doing this as well. both at the government level as well as nonprofit and private and university. So that's kind of my question. I don't know if I should leave that up there and minimize it, because I'd like to be able to see all of you.
Yeah, Dan, before you leave that, would you go
Mm-hmm.
back 2 slides? You had a what
Sure.
works and what doesn't work slide, the one before that.
Yeah, this one?
No, go back
Or the
to
one before that?
before that.
This
Before
one?
this one. Before this one. There it is.
Okay.
And would you
Or wait a minute, there's a
there it
lag
is.
time
This
there.
is
So
perfect. This is the one. Example.
this one's fine? Yeah.
Yeah, example, healthy soil roundtable. That phrase, okay, now you can, I didn't have anything to write with, and I wanted to remember example, healthy soil roundtable. Thank you. Will you please, you can stop sharing screen if that's what you want to do, and go forth, and now I can remember what I wanted to remember. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. And I'm going to take notes, but also while I try to interact as well. Let's see, I got to
I can stop your
share,
sharing.
yeah,
Here you go.
it's right at the bottom. I just did it.
Okay, great.
All right.
And Bet,
So
you want to
thank you
remove
for
this spotlight
your
for me?
patience and listening.
Thanks. So Dan, I just need to say that was the most clear, most succinct, most understandable description I've heard of your enterprises ever. I want to thank you for that. And then next, as an extrapolation of what the support pod position is, what does support for you look like? So I saw one question there. Do you want us to take a round of just first impressions? Do you want to ask a specific question? You know, how this is about what does support look like for you? So what first would help you? Would it help to have just a round of that intuit response?
Yeah, it actually would. And in the background of that, I'm always thinking about this inquiry. What is integral leadership in action? And what does that have to do with my life or your life or our life together as a community? But that's background to first responses, because I know communication is obviously central to it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on Zoom together. And communication is central to leadership. But, you know, there's different kinds of leadership. And I can easily go intellectual on the leadership side, and I tend to do that. But at the same time, it's my leadership relative to you folks who are all engaged in these resources as users.
So let me just invite Wheaton and Eric, because Bet, you're not allowed to talk with that voice.
I'm not exactly sure what's being asked, Kim. I think you offered up time for us to respond, but I'm not.
Great. Here's what I understood Dan said. So I propose, Dan, if it works for you, that we actually have 2 rounds. The first round being a response to a general gestalt of your presentation. So I'll model what I think. Okay, Whedon. So I already said, Dan, that I have great gratitude and appreciation for how you organize that. I understand. From that position, I'm going to say that when we have this premise of what does support look like for Dan, the one thing that stood out for me is, okay, Dan, I have all of that information, slide after slide after slide. What's the specific question that I could help with? For example, whatever that was about explore roundtable, whatever that phrase is.
Healthy soil roundtable.
There we go. That to me was an example of what I thought was a specific that you could focus on as a strategy to get more people more engaged in this whole domain that you're working in. So all kinds of roundtables. For me, it sparked, what might Dan do locally? What might Dan do on Zoom? What might Dan try here on a support pod? How Dan might organize roundtables to actually do specific things that people could take away and do specific things. I hand it to the next. Who wants to go?
I'm gonna just talk. I don't care. I'm here. So Dan,
be damned.
that's right. As I'm looking at this, I'm thinking of my computer architecture background, where you have all these different systems, and each of them has relationships with other systems. And on each line, very similar to some of your diagrams, but on the line it says sends, key to other system, right? It says there's a line between each system, and it says like sends these 5 data points. And in your system, it's sending manure and receiving something. I don't know. So I think maybe a diagram like that, just making more diagrams that help, like you said, you have these different levels of abstraction. That's just something that we did in computer architecture when we have 95 different systems that all talk to each other and just trying to understand. And what we do is we have a use case of, install new, service. I worked at Verizon. And so that would have 100 steps. And we would basically show how each step interacted with the previous step. So I think taking like a use case of create food, or I know it's going to be complicated, Dan, but I'm just saying like you can kind of simplify in some ways around like each of these different areas, and that can help get just people on the same page when we were looking at the abstract and the communication complexity. I wrote some of these challenges down: communication to multiple levels. And then you could even take like maybe the more popular ones and make them even more simple, to the point of like cartoon characters, and then teach that to kids if that was your goal. I'll stop there and let you digest or respond, or maybe someone else will be inspired.
Yeah, so my response is the communication, and what role does collaboration play? I think we actually, and how is integral any different from what we're already doing? I guess it's part of the process of evolving those tools that you just recommended. Because yeah, I've never been in the software world, so and doing this economic materials management world that I'm in requires a lot of communication and leadership that's not hierarchical. But it has a big educational piece. I guess people have to come up to speed, is what I'm hearing you say. People need to come up to speed to a basic level in order to function democratically within economic change. This is mostly all happening at the local level, between local governments and local businesses and local citizens, a lot of whom are environmental groups who are pushing for this as well. So, yeah.
I think there's probably a lot there, and
Mhm.
software architecture has been wrestling with this stuff there's like event driven things, like something happens in the system and then a bunch of, effects happen. So you
Exactly.
could kind of think of it, and I think the education is just you could show these diagrams to people every day and just start getting people to understand like, oh, everything's related. Like, oh, I
Mhm.
can't just dump this or I can't just throw this in the garbage because someone needs that. So
Right.
basically, yeah, just educating.
Yeah, we had a big conference last week here in California called the California Resource Recycling Association, and I have a collegial and ongoing liaison relationship with that whole association and my compost association. And one of the big discussions was the problem of trash in the organic bin. In other words, contaminating the feedstocks so that it ends up having to go back into the landfill anyway. So so I think creating work groups um, makes sense, and that's where the team approach comes in. You know, I'm not fond of the term committees because I'm more fond of the term uh, work groups or working groups. And then I am fond of the teams because teams is a process of collaborating while you're trying to achieve an objective, whether it's military or sport, or in our case, cultural and economic transformation.
And is this the consumer that's doing this, the residential
No,
person?
it's professionals as well as advocacy. So it's all the environmental groups who have a stake in this. It's
Hmm.
also corporations like I have members of my association that are um, they're packaging companies and they're moving away from um, single-use plastics into compostable plastics, which is very controversial in our industry. Um, but they also come from the chemical industry and the whole, they're large companies, but then there's a lot of small startups. I work with, like California Climate Agricultural Network, and they've been very supportive of building healthy soil and using climate money to go um, into the healthy soil program in CDFA. Um, so there's a what I've found in the circular economy is that it's not really a circle. It's like a circle with lots of lines all the way across the circle and around the circle. It's kind of like if you don't look beyond the walls of your cubicle, it's like you don't the world looks flat from in there. But once you get up and around, it's not only circular and it's highly interconnected like a web. And to me, integral leadership should help people do that somehow.
I can share a little bit from when I directed YMCA camps and was involved in from the beginning LEED constructed buildings and
Oh yeah.
some rehab. And so as a recipient as a audience of someone who was spending money, was creating refuse, and was eager to be a better environmental citizen. I was helped by a group that put together workshops, and they had architects and they had a number of people that had a way of monetizing their involvement, perhaps. But I was helped greatly by a group such as yours who said, here are some of the people involved in the complexity. And here's how they have helped in the past. And here's a contact. And so I ended up with a work group composed of architects and landscape architects and engineers, and I wanted the bulldozer drivers. I want everybody I can get. And we ended up with a very cooperative project, but none of it would have happened if someone in a higher position such as yours, who understood the complexity and who could tap into parts of it with phone numbers and examples, and here's what this group wants to hear when you talk to them. They don't want to hear about that part of it. They want to hear about this.
Yeah.
And it was very helpful. Very, very helpful.
Yes, that's great, Wheaton. Thank you.
Was
Eric,
that
do you
helpful?
have any? Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you. Eric, do you have any reflections?
Yeah, it's an interesting process for me to come into this because I don't know that much about your world. I can, generally follow, some of what you have on your slides and so forth. But I'm looking at this question of how does someone who doesn't have a lot of, background in a particular topic area offer something of relevance to what you're doing? Because I might think of things, but at my low level of information, I don't know necessarily how useful or relevant that is. So I'm trying to find my way in, and I'm going back to, the question that you had before and your what hasn't worked. And you said communicating to multiple levels of cognitive and moral development. And I would say too, just information, that it's not necessarily, cognitive development. You can have sharp people, but if it's not their domain of expertise too, then it gets to be tricky. So what I'm curious is, how does this get chunked down so that you're able to elicit useful responses from people at the level at which they're able to make contributions? Because if I try to go above my ceiling, I can maybe play some ego game and pretend to be helpful, but I'm not really being so. So I have to, have something that's focused enough to say, well, here's a domain where I actually think that I could have something of value to contribute. So for me, when I, come to this whole thing, I go back to the thing of, what are better questions, and how do we spend, time coming up with exactly what those questions are so that they can guide our thinking. I heard something, and I don't know if I'm quoting this correctly, but I think Einstein was asked, if you had an hour to spend to solve a problem, how would you go about it? And he's like, well, I'll spend the first 55 minutes just figuring out what the best question is going to be. That more time is on, the question formulation than on the answers. So I grabbed a book, which I recently got. I haven't read it yet, but I heard this guy speak. I'll hold it up here. Hal Gregerson. So he's executive director of the MIT Leadership Center, and is written on creativity and so forth. Their questions are the answer. I heard him present at a World Business Executive Coaches Association and was really impressed. I see this has a book award too. But he's a super creative individual, and I like this whole idea of working with, the questions and trying to figure out what those are. Having not quite read the
What was
book
the
yet.
author's name again?
I'll hold it up. Hal Gregerson. If you could read that.
We can. Thank you.
There you
Yes,
go.
Eric.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, I try not to buy too many more books nowadays, but I was impressed enough with this guy's presentation that it's like, okay, yeah. So, here we are in, this setting where we have a, a certain amount of, time. Say we had half an hour. What's going to be most generative for you in this amount of period with those of us who are here now? What are the things that are going to, tap the intelligences that are available that are going to make the most contribution, in the context that we have right here? That's sort of what's driving me right now.
Thank you. That's all been very extremely helpful. What would be helpful to me is always, I'm really fond of structure and framework and formats. It's kind of, to me, that's what technology is. Another shorthand for technology is recipe knowledge. And since we're all co-creating this, there is no pat recipe for how to create a circular local economy. But I'm also wanting to know if you guys, or if ILiA collaboration, because I know it's been kind of spaced out. I've been spaced out, in terms of time and space and interactions. Is there anybody trying to or working on, or have you guys talked about how integral leadership actually is growing, evolving, and being implemented? Are there any patterns, I guess you could say? That kind of reminds me of The Patterning Instinct by Jeremy Lent. Yeah,
So Dan, let me answer that this way.
Yeah.
And then Bet, if you want to shout in. My impression is, since you came up with the idea in open space and came up with this name, Integral Leadership in Action, in 2003 or whatever that was. And then we've over time formalized into a club and then into a nonprofit. And then we, it's always a question of how much energy is there, how many people. And you said people don't collaborate unless they're paid. Okay, I said that more strongly than you said it.
Yeah, right. That was one of my challenges.
So
How do you build that in?
My point is that the only way that I know of, and that we in ILiA stress, is we understand the need for community. So if what we do is afford somewhere that is comfortable, and it's stimulating, and it engages our curiosity, and also it just feels good, then people engage, and then we get that. Can we make them? No. And have we in the past been mostly event-centered? Yes. So no, we're no experts either. We're just a small board of 6 people. And so your question about leadership, I want to make 2 quick comments. Number one, I think Eric is spot on about the question. T. Poling, one of our board members, uses David Bohm's dialogue in corporate settings, hundreds of people. And now they can hardly stand it. Well, what's the question? Well, what's the question? So that there can be interaction before they actually get into the meat of whatever it is that he was asked to deliver for days. And what's the question is the real struggle for T always. What is the question for that group of people at that time to stimulate what Aftab Omer is calling collaborativity, how the whole system actualizes its potential? So that's number one. And number two, I also agree with both Wheaton and Eric and Bet when we talk about communication to multiple levels. I think is one of the things that we as integral leaders are striving to make more obvious to ourselves and others. We understand that if we have a room full of people at multiple levels, which I have in every college class that I teach, then what language do I use? What strategies do I employ? And so in that same way, cognitive development is one, and it requires information. So I'll sieve down and say what I've heard from all of us is, what is the small deliverable package that you want to open by a specific question at any particular meeting of a group? Wheaton, Eric, Bet, did I grab that?
Yeah, I'm liking the way you phrased that. I was trying to write it down. I didn't get it all written, but I got the, the gist of it, this small delivery. Again, this is, chunking it down with the specificity of, who are we talking to now? What's the context? What's the motivation? Just to have all these factors in mind in terms of what is going to elicit the most useful response in any given context. And it's going to change from context to context. And so, to really keep that specificity and this sense of what is the capacity that's in the room at any given point, and asking things that are within that capacity and not beyond it in a way where eyes glaze over and people check out. It's like, okay, how do we find that, which is a matter of attunement, I would say too, that your presence, Dan, and your really tracking what's going on with people to feel what's the resonance right here? Are people really interested in this? If I touch them in some heart way, if you're dealing with people, for instance, in the environmental communities who have a vested interest in this kind of thing as one of the stakeholders, and what's the language that's going to speak to them in terms of benefit to the planet, and how is that going to be a different language than you talk to a corporate entity where they're more driven by profits. Perhaps they want to have purpose and planet and all that too, but primarily they're going to have a different motivation, and so the message is going to have to change for all that. So I think just tracking that landscape and then feeling what is it that's going to draw out something that's going to be of value in this. So
this is great, you guys. This is really good. Thank you. I've been taking notes and nodding because I'm really enjoying the feedback. I'm also thinking about how best to document it besides just the recordings of each of these conversations. Bet, I see you have your hand raised.
So this is so much reminding me of my software architecture years.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I went into a new system, I would ask, like, what's the number one problem? What's the
Mm-hmm.
number one neck bleed problem? And you mentioned this contamination. Is that the number one challenge that's really, really keeping you up at night?
Yeah, contamination is the inverse of quality product.
Hmm.
And
So I
so
would
what
take
I'm
that and then break that down into who is contaminating it. And maybe there's 10 different kind of groups, or maybe it's just one. And then from there, it's like, why? So that would be some research. And then from there, if it's like education, then you need to do like a whole campaign of how do we educate these people? Who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? How do we measure if it's working? Right? Do we run a focus group to see if it's the right levels? And maybe you have like 10 levels of education. Anyways, I know I'm talking fast right now. And or maybe it's a tool. They want to do the right thing. They know they should, but they don't have a tool. So maybe then it's like development of a tool, and you have to get that now deployed, and so you run a process. Anyways, are you starting to see where I'm going with this?
I am, and it's good, and it's kind of partly where I was going, but it's also um, giving me a whole lot of new ways to think about it.
Hmm. All right, maybe that triggered something in someone else's brain.
Your voice sounds pretty good, Bet, by the way.
Yeah.
It just hurts. It just
It hurts.
hurts. She's sacrificing. Yes. Sacrifice. Wheaton, do you have any thoughts that you want to contribute? Because we're going to get up to the top of the hour pretty soon here. We want to check in with Dan, how he wants to close.
I wanted to throw out the two things. One, I wanted to throw out the name Steve McIntosh. He is working right now with a group called Institute for Cultural Evolution on large system change, country change, smaller systems change, and he's devoting his life to it. So he might be a source, Dan, that I know he would be interested in your work, and his group would, and there may be some practical ideas from working with that group or looking into it a little bit.
Great. I
One,
will definitely do that. So thank you. Because I have met Steve way back when, but I haven't interacted with him, so I wasn't aware of that work. So that's great.
yeah, he has some pretty heavy hitters involved, and it's it's all about integral leadership.
Excellent.
Yeah, happy to help with that. And then the only one thing I think is really important every single time you have a conversation or meet with anybody is to have what's in it for them. I mean, that's part of any change process, and whether it's money or it's publication opportunity or glory. I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm doing good in the world. You know, what do they want, and what's in it for them? And if we can't answer that, you know, they're going on to somebody that can do something for them.
Excellent. I was trying to use the old one, WIFM, which was what's in it for me versus what's in it for them. Yeah.
And I love that.
By the way.
Yeah, I love that, Wheaton. That's a great suggestion, the what's in it for them. And something that just pops to me in the moment too is, and what could be in it for them too. So to future pace a little bit that, you know, from their best self, they might have this aspirational dimension of what's in it for them that isn't quite, you know, where we just take it at face value, but we look at how do we bump that up? How do we nudge it just a little bit to draw out the best?
Indeed. Wow. Great. Wow. Thank you guys. You guys have been really good coaches and therapists.
Dan, how about
Dan,
you? Go ahead, Bet.
I just want to say I would love to meet with you more, Dan, and help you simplify some of these flow charts. Like we could take one use case and sort of like pull the threads, because that one that's a big spaghetti one, all the arrows are pointed to everyone. We could take that and make something. This is what I did in my career, and I'm remembering how much I loved it. So Dan, I'm happy to meet with you more about this.
Thank you very much. I do have an artist in my network, but he's not as I don't know what to say. He's still pretty immature, so it would be wonderful to work with you on
Very
that.
cool.
That was very helpful when I ran an organization that had, you know, I had 1,000 priorities, but having somebody able, having somebody able to say, here's what this group did, here's what this group did, and take that complexity and say, you got a phone, right? Here's some things that have happened with that phone. And I think that's, I'm simplifying what your offer to Dan was.
Mm-hmm.
Bet, is there anything else you want to say? I was going to suggest that Dan gets to make a summary statement or some kind of a closure that we all just have a word or two, a phrase or two, a sentence or two, if we want to at this end. Start
That
that.
sounds great. And then after that, let's see if someone on this call wants to run the next one, bring their topic to us. So yeah, Dan, go ahead and summarize, and then we'll all put in one word.
Well, I just have to say again, and maybe with some slightly different words, I feel very grateful for your time and your intention and your energy and your support. So thank you.
Well, I feel re-energized, even though I was feeling a little sluggish earlier. So that's what I feel. Who wants to go next?
I'm very happy there's a Dan Noble in the world doing this work, and anything I can do to cheer you on or to help, I want to.
Thanks, Wheaton. That's great.
And I'll say, I learned a lot, Dan, and I think all of the things that I'm thinking as a board member of ILiA in terms of how these support pods can actually be helpful. Bet will post the recording, you know, onto the website. There's a whole page full of past recordings. And I feel like, thank you, Bet, thank you, Wheaton, thank you, Eric, thank you, Dan. There was a lot of really specific information that's applicable to leadership that was named clearly, specifically.
Yeah, and perhaps to add, one last piece from this side too is just a trusting in emergence. So, we can think that, it's just me coming up, forwarding this idea and I have to collaborate. And when we think about it that level, we might be missing something, that there's also, a deeper current and the desire of people to be helpful for that, with that, and just things coming up that you never expected and out of the blue, and to remain receptive to the possibilities that we can't foresee when we think about it in our own terms, that would be a new habit of mind.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.